Africa will unite, will celebrate, and she will dance again.
Well, a very good evening to you and welcome to Unfiltered on SABC 3 as well as Channel 404. I'm your host, Criselda Lewis. So tonight we celebrate Africa Month. The month of May, we bring you an hour special with the first 30 minutes on SABC 3 as usual, and continuing the last section on Channel 404. Please join us there from 9:30 as well. Through the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, the African continent became a pioneer in being the first continent to focus on continental unity. Well, this was aimed at encouraging nation building through unity and freedom from oppression. Now, South Africans are also amongst those earlier generations who made enormous contributions towards this effort. Now, the speech of Dr. Pixlika Seme in 1906 on the regeneration of Africa would be echoed by the generations that followed and enhanced through a number of initiatives aimed at decolonization and regeneration of the continent. Now, Africa Month also seeks to increase the appreciation and demand for arts and culture, goods and services, and to stimulate competitive markets for trade amongst African countries. Now, the Department of Arts and Culture also seeks to cultivate an African identity through the polarization of the national flag and the continental flag, as well as the national anthem and the African Union anthem. But the Black consciousness movement of the late Stephen Bantu Biko seems to have died, some would say, and is no longer appealing in today's democratic dispensation, which is mainly influenced and driven by Western ideals. So our question to you tonight is Black consciousness ideology still relevant today? Do join us on Twitter and Facebook as well using our hashtag SABC News Unfiltered. And of course, you can tweet us at SABC News Online. Thank you so much for joining us. So this evening, we've got a great panel with us to discuss this particular issue. And of course, here from our right is Mr. Themba Godi, who's with the African People's Convention. Very good evening to you. Thanks for your time. Professor Shirley Hendricks, who's the Executive Director at the SHRC's Africa Institute. Thank you so much for joining us. As well as Mr. Strike Tukwane, who's with the Azanian People's Organization. Thanks for your time. As well as Mr. Narias Moloto, who's with the Pan-Africanist Congress. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I think perhaps a great place to start is during African Month, we can ask ourselves whether Pan-Africanism is dead. Let's start with you, Mr. Themba Godi.
Well, for as long as the African people live, Pan-Africanism will always be alive, because Pan-Africanism is about the African people. It is about their history, their present condition, and their yearning for a brighter future. If you are an African and you deny Pan-Africanism, then you are not liberated, and therefore cannot liberate anybody. At least in Africa, there can be no ideology or idea that is superior to Pan-Africanism, because it is about the African people. It arises from the conditions of Africa. It is about Africa, it is about Africans. It is about unity, it is about freedom. So there is no way, in conditions where poverty, where diseases, where social degradation still forms very much a part of the African story, as a condition of external and internal factors, Pan-Africanism as a weapon, therefore cannot be relevant. It will always be relevant.
I'll come to you there, Professor, but I just want to start with the political parties. And, you know, let's come to you, Mr. Tukwane. Is Pan-Africanism dead? Let's get your view on that before we come to you, Mr. Moloto.
As explained by Mr. Godi on Pan-Africanism, I would be more competent to speak about the Black consciousness, and does not actually make a difference between the two. But can I ask a question in rhetoric? when people are refusing to accept Christianity, do we then say that Christianity is dead? It's not dead, it is the people who must be conscientized. I can go to an extent to say it is alive now because it is the material conditions when people feel the pinch that they yearn for it. Maybe people after 1994, they've had a little reprieve where they think they've arrived and things are going to happen for them. But it is going to be more reignited in the passage of time when people realize that we left a gold mine. We left something that should actually be working for us. We are in this dire strait because we have left what should actually be working for us. For as long as we have not reached that point where Biko says, in time we'll give this country a humanity matter, then it simply means that people must find themselves and be able to go back to black consciousness and Pan-Africanism. But what are the instruments that measures whether an ideology has not died? An ideology does not die simply because people are not subscribing or there are problems with that ideology. We'll go back to issues of socialism and say if people have become revisionist and are not working out and are attracted by capitalism, therefore socialism is irrelevant. It is not. The system remains relevant. The ideology remains relevant. It must just have a way to be taken to the people so that it can work for them. But the conditions, when you say to us, Africans are more Afrophobic now, what does it call for? It calls for Pan-Africanism so that it becomes a medicine that can heal them. When black people start to hate themselves and do things that are untoward towards themselves, that calls for an antidote. And that is black consciousness.
And I will give you a direct example of that as we continue this discussion. Let me bring you in there, Mr. Moloto. I think, let's give some of a very recent example, perhaps, that you'd be able to give an explanation to. I mean, look at South Africa's election. Just the other day, one could perhaps argue by the performance of political parties such as yourselves as well as the APC, that perhaps others could argue that the ideals of Pan-Africanism do not resonate with society today based on the way that they performed in the elections. Some could argue that.
Yes, but that would be wrong. Pan-Africanism is a philosophy and ideology that promote the spiritual and material interest of the African people. It's an outlook that rejects domination of the African people. Now, therefore, it cannot go wrong. I mean, to compare elections which are subject to many factors, particularly insofar as organizational concerns, and then ideology, which guide what to call the outlook, which guide give people what to call a real self, and try to basically define. Today we find that Pan-Africanism is the outlook and ideology that everybody talks about, because first it makes people to discover who they are and what they're all about.
Has there been a commonality? Let me bring you in there, Prof. There are those who argue that perhaps the issue of Pan-Africanism and where we stand with it today on the continent, some would argue hasn't worked because there hasn't been a commonality of interests on the African continent. And the reason why I say this is because you'd find, for example, where in Zimbabwe, there are accusations that some of the worst atrocities that have been meted out against Zimbabwe's own people were meted out by the likes of the former president Robert Mugabe, who people had previously seen as a liberator and somebody who would take that country forward. Is there a problem with the commonality of interest on the African continent that would make those argue who believe that Pan-Africanism is dead?
Okay, I'll answer both your first question and the second question in one, because I think the question needs to be slightly modified. Not is Pan-Africanism dead, but is it relevant today? Does it speak to the issues that we are confronting today? So those issues that you're raising are some of the issues, right? Our own people, we've seen a change of the guard, but our own people begin to oppress us. So I think that Pan-Africanism is relevant. It's relevant for the same reasons it was relevant at the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, in the 1980s, when we formed the Organization of African Unity in 1963, when we transformed that into the African Union in 2002. And because it seeks to deal with the development challenges. So when it was first formed, it spoke to issues of anti-slavery. Then in the late 1950s, it spoke to issues of colonialism, the need for independence, the need for the rehumanization and dignity of people on this continent, for our independence, our freedom. Now we need it to speak to our issues of development, as Temba mentioned. Those are the issues we confront today. But I think what has happened while we see a decline in it is because we have abrogated our responsibilities from what was a movement to political leaders to implement. And those leaders then find themselves collectively in institutions like the African Union that we formed to take this particular agenda forward. Okay, but the African Union and regional organizations don't have sufficient power to do this. They're secretariats, right? And the leaders operate from narrow nationalism. And so we see them wanting to protect their own sovereignty, their own interests, and not give up some of that sovereignty for a collective good. That is what we need now. We see its relevance then in organizations like Black Lives Matter, where young people are taking it up.
We'll talk about that.
In when our children are still fighting for the right to wear their hair naturally at schools here, when they are fighting for their curriculum to be decolonized, we see its relevance. So we celebrate it only now when Africa Week or Africa Month comes along, but it's there all the time, mostly in its cultural forms rather than in its political forms.
I want to read what someone had also sent to us here on the program, who'd also argued and says that Pan-Africanism has been hijacked by a few black liberation struggle elites who fleece resources under the guise of liberating the masses. Now, we tend to see some of that picture also being painted here in South Africa when we look at issues relating to state capture. Under the guise of wanting to liberate the poor, resources of the country are being fleeced. Let me bring you in there, Mr. Moloto, your argument on that.
Look, it's correct that the founders of African liberation movement and Pan-Africanist, like Kwame Nkrumah, the outlook was that Africa has to be united. And that's the basis for Pan-Africanism, that its people have to be united, not only its leaders, and also that the wealth of Africa should be enjoyed by the African people and the masses in particular. Now, if you look today and see how far have we moved since then, we haven't moved because it's still leaders that meet, and its people are still prevented to meet by the same borders that were created by the colonialists. Now, therefore, it is quite correct that Pan-Africanism today it might be used to benefit individuals and elite in the leadership than the African people themselves.
Dr. Tokwane, how do we deal with this particular issue? Because you find the ideals that the likes of Stephen Bantu Biko had championed, amongst many others, of course. But then you have a situation where on the African continent, as rich as it is, as Mr. Moloto has mentioned, Africa's people continue not to benefit from the richness of its very own continent. So have African leaders not heeded the call for Pan-Africanism? Have they not heeded the call for this black consciousness? Because while Africa continues to remain rich, its people continue to suffer at the hands of their very own black leadership. Or African leadership.
Remember that there was a time and a stage in life where people relegated the issue of liberation to the leaders. But when Steve Biko and company came, they say we must liberate the people themselves. They say you can never be a spectator. in the game that you're supposed to play. You must become your own liberator. And that helped to take and catapult the country into a position where black people took the responsibility of freedom to themselves after being conscientized. Remember that black consciousness, it is more the freedom of the mind. That we must go and teach, we must go and preach, we must go and conscientize each and every soul to such an extent that they also play a role in their own liberation. And that took the country quite a distance until 1994. And in 1994, the message that was preached to a lot of our people was the message that don't do anything. We have liberated you and we have arrived. Therefore, go and sit tight in your place, we'll build your house, we'll bring you clinic, we'll do everything for you, we'll come and fix a pump in your house. But until that we are able to say to people, it has something to do with yourselves. You must continue the conscientization because for more than 300 years, this indoctrination, we're battered with it as a people. So it doesn't take 10 years to be out of it. We must continue long after 1994 to continue to politicize, to continue to conscientize. And this is the responsibility that we say it must move away from the leaders and it must go to the people themselves. We must be able to do that in high schools. We must be able to do that. But you see, it is not like there were no challenges.
The messaging of that would need to be relevant to the challenges of today.
Certainly.
We'll continue talking about that. We just need to take a short break. We'll be right back straight after this. Stay with us here on Unfiltered. We'll continue this discussion when we get back. Hello again. Thank you very much for staying with us. If you've just joined us, you're most welcome. You're watching Unfiltered. Now, May is Africa Month, and as the continent celebrates unity, we reevaluate our values and ideals as Africans. And our guests, of course, tonight are Pan-Africanist Congress PAC President Neres Moloto, the President of the African People's Convention APC Themba Godi. We'll also have the President of the Azanian People's Organization Azapo Strike Tokwane, as well as Prof. Cheryl Hendricks, who is the Executive Director of the Africa Institute of South Africa, ISA, at the Human Sciences Research Council. And we're asking you, of course, is the black consciousness ideology still relevant today? We asked you to engage with us. If we could have some of those tweets come up and read what some of you are saying. Pule Mores says, yes, indeed. If we don't define it out of context as if is racial, but rather, as Biko coined it, as psychological liberation from any form of oppression for a human race. Thank you very much, Pule, for engaging with us there. Let's also take another tweet there from Onke, who says, yes, it is important that as an African child, I must preserve my culture, traditions and heritage, because once I lose my identity of who I am, then it's best to know that colonization is then upon one by oneself by adopting a culture that is mine, that being West aligned. Thank you so much, Onke, for engaging with us. Edward, you also sent us a tweet there. He says black consciousness was used by Stephen Bantu Biko to empower black people's minds, not ashamed of their skin color, against white racism and superior white people's mindsets. Steve Biko's black is beautiful and was not promoting racism. It was promoting black people's pride and self-respect. Edward, thank you so much for engaging with us here on Unfiltered. I want to come to you, Mr. Godi. I asked Mr. Moloto a question regarding whether Pan-Africanism had been hijacked by a few individuals, who obviously come out in the guise of wanting to liberate the poor. Because we see what's happening in South Africa, and there are many other examples on the African continent where people believe that those who are supposed to ultimately restore their dignity as Africans are doing the exact opposite.
Well, true. I think one thing that we must also be careful of is to make an assumption that by virtue of being an African, then you're Pan-Africanist. some of these leaders who are in the African Union are not necessarily Pan-Africanists. And we see how in the continent external forces intervene when you have leaders who want to put the interests of the people first. You look at Ivory Coast, whatever the issues might have been, but part of Laurent Gbagbo's problem with France was the fact that he wanted to change the colonial relations. And what happened? He was taken to The Hague, and the puppet of France came in as the president of the Ivory Coast. So whatever is happening in the Ivory Coast today can never be said to be happening in the name of Pan-Africanism. It is happening through somebody who we know is a puppet of France. So we need to be able to distinguish. If you look at Kwame Nkrumah, if you look at Thomas Sankara, if you look at Muammar Gaddafi, you'll see that their thinking and their actions are totally incomparable with some of the parasitic leaders who steal from their own people. Yes, the rhetoric about our people and about development might be there, but at a conceptual level, at an ideological level, do they acknowledge, do they espouse Pan-Africanism? No. So when you have a meeting of the AU, it's not a meeting of revolutionaries. It's a meeting where you might find that overwhelmingly the majority are not even Pan-Africanists. They're just very managerialist in their approach. They have no vision or a theoretical concept of how to run society on the basis of a firm ideology. So I think for me, that's where the problem is. So take South Africa. You remove Thabo Mbeki, who was there as a leader who proclaimed that I'm a Pan-Africanist, in theory as well as in words. None. So
I'll ask you whether that, we'll get a bit political there, whether over the past 10 years perhaps that had disappeared in South Africa, but we have to take this short break. We'll come back to you very shortly. We'll continue this discussion here on Unfiltered. Please stay with us. Hello again, thank you very much for staying with us. We're still asking you tonight whether the black consciousness ideology is still relevant today. We've been asking you to engage with us on social media. Here on Twitter, I see Mahale has tweeted us. He says it is still relevant. It's just that it is not the idea of the current ruling party, hence the foundation of the PAC, and it is not in the Freedom Charter. ANC is not an organization of black consciousness, but the liberation movement. I wish they can revisit their policy. That's Mohale's view. He sent us that tweet. Sinatla says it is more relevant today after the achievement of political liberation. The development of the African society has to be informed by an understanding of our history, including appreciation of our cultures, languages and traditions. Our world is Eurocentric and Africans hate one another. That's Sinatla's view. Of course, sending us there using the hashtag SABC Unfiltered. Pan-Africanist says very relevant, especially after the independence of African countries. You can see most African leaders didn't heed the call of black consciousness with corruption and looting against their own people. Pan-Africanists, thank you very much for tweeting us there. Monges also says he used at SABC News Online, we are still black. I think that settles the scores. Thank you so much to all of you for engaging with us. George Koza also says, well, let's not forget those who fought for our freedom, but we must also move on. The problem in Africa is that liberation parties, e.g. ANC, ZANU-PF, Renamo, believe they have entitlement to rule forever just because they had those people in their parties. George, thank you very much for engaging with us. A lot of the sentiment, all right, before we continue this discussion, we'll have to say a goodbye to our viewers on SABC3. Thank you so much for joining us. If you want to stay with this discussion, do join us on the SABC channel 404, where we continue this discussion and we ask you, is the ideology of Pan-Africanism still relevant today? We say good night to our viewers on SABC3. Welcome back. Thank you very much for staying with us as we continue this discussion on the SABC Channel 404. Thank you very much to all of those on SABC 3 for joining us. We're asking you tonight, is the ideology of Pan-Africanism still relevant today? Perhaps the messaging needs to change. We'll talk a bit about that. Mr. Gordy, just before we went off on SABC 3, I mean, some of the tweets that we saw from some of the viewers saying that, looting and the corruption that we see, certainly that was not in the mindset of those like Kwame Nkrumah as well as Steve Biko when they brought forward the ideology of Pan-Africanism and the building of Africa. None of that was anticipated, of course.
No, very true. If you go to Sobukwe's definition of true leadership, it starts with the complete subjugation of self and ends with an undying love for one's people. Now, if you have that, then clearly you can't, as a leader, start by stealing from your own people. And the people who are driven by crass materialism and consumerism, who find themselves in leadership positions, think about themselves first instead of the people. If you look at what Kwame Nkrumah did in 9 years, you get this from Ghanaians themselves, was much more than what those who came after him did in 30 years. And that was primarily and simple because he was committed to the cause of the people. And I think that selflessness is what ideology must be able to teach you, to cleanse you, if you fully and firmly are committed to the cause of the people. And I believe Pan-Africanism in relation to the need for continental unity, we see Europe is uniting, and yet they are rich, we are poor, we are divided. In relation to the economy, in terms of ensuring that the economy works for our people, you don't have an economic growth that does not translate into any tangible benefit to our people. Now, if you don't have leadership, everything rests, falls and stands with leadership. Look at Rwanda, 1994. They had that horrific genocide. But look at where Rwanda is today. Well, there are all sorts of things flying around, but you can't take away the fact that there have been tremendous progress that has been achieved because there is clarity of vision, there is clarity of leadership, there is clarity of purpose, and there is seriousness in relation to issues that affect the people. I think that is the deficit that we're having, leadership.
Prof, if we look at issues of, unaccountability, poor governance, as well as, poor leadership, some could argue, on the continent, a part of the things that would put such ideologies at risk, where you have governments on the continent, there's just poor governance, unaccountability, excessive looting.
So there were moments on this continent where we had good leaders and good leadership. They were at that moment of independence with the likes of Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere and them. And then again, with the formation of the African Union, with Thabo Mbeki and Abdoulaye Wade, and those who were at the center of that African Renaissance, we don't see that kind of leadership now. This is partly why we are in the situation that we are in today in terms of going back on poor governance, having rulers, not leaders, rulers who occupy positions of presidents. The office of the president, wanting to extend their stays when we agreed on this continent that we would not be doing that you would have term limits. We had agreed on Agenda 2063, we agreed on a constitutive act. Very few of those rulers went back to actually implement that in their own countries.
But isn't it the fault of institutions like the African Union?
It's also our fault as people on this continent for not being able to hold these rulers to account. And notice I make that distinction very clear between leaders and rulers. Very few leaders on this continent. We see forms of leadership expressed by Kagame in relation to rebuilding his particular country, with challenges as well, I dare say. But at the moment, who do we turn to for the kind of visionary leadership that we need right now to move us forward, for the kind of visionary leadership that will once again take us back to those core values of Pan-Africanism, because I think those core values are what we need in order to drive this continent forward. If we organize organize our societies along those lines, we will move forward. So now we have, for example, the Continental Free Trade Agreement. That is the latest. It is for regional integration on this continent. We had the Lagos Plan of Action, we had the Abuja Treaty, and now we have the CFTA. The other two were not implemented for those narrow interests. I think trade on this continent is about 15 to 20% only intra-African trade. How are we going to make this CFTA work? What do we need to have in place now? What do we need to do differently in order to make this one work, I think? How are we going to be able to trade in goods and services and capital, but we don't want our people to move on this continent. We don't want labor to move. We get stopped on the borders. It takes you 10 days to come in, to get a visa to come into South Africa. If we can't have freedom of movement, some of the most basic things of Pan-Africanism, we're not moving forward with this agenda.
Who should be held responsible for that? Again, I want to come to the issue of, I'll come to you gentlemen very shortly. Who should be held responsible for that? Because you've got institutions like the African Union. I recall one of our colleagues reporting from there recently where there were talks about reform and how the majority of the funding should be from member states themselves. But Africa's agenda and program of action in terms of development not at risk when you have institutions such as the African Union who perhaps an agenda is being pushed from elsewhere. If you look at the funding of the African Union on its own, currently where China, for example, is the main sponsor. You look at the building that was put up by China in Addis.
Okay, so who's the African Union made up of? It's made up of these very same rulers, right?
So the AU is useless?
No, I would not say the AU is useless. It is the institution that we wanted to form. We need to find better mechanisms to keep those rulers to account. I'm very optimistic with what has happened in Sudan, with what has happened in Algeria, and I think we're going to see more of that happening on the continent where people are taking control of their lives. We focus too much on this continent in terms of representation and not on participation, and we need to go back now to figuring out how are we going to take collective responsibility in the development of this continent. If we as the people don't do it, it's not going to happen.
I want to go back to that issue of commonality of interests, where it seems, Mr. Tokwane, that might be one of the challenges that we're facing, where, for example, where you have institutions like the African Union, where it seems clearly there's no speaking with one voice on how to take Africa forward, because perhaps of some of the interests that are within that particular body itself.
It's going to be a problem, and it's going to remain a problem as some of the leaders are actually in the pockets of the others, the capitalist world. Money rules the world. So it should not just be left to those leaders in the African Union. The most important thing is for the citizens to participate in their own liberation. Hence we said there was a time in our own society in South Africa where you had people becoming observers and hoping that somebody somewhere is going to come and liberate them. It cannot be like that. And I like what Steve did. He says, no, let us go to these university students and tell them that they cannot be observers in their own matter. And they cannot leave their matter to the others. In actual fact, what made a strong breakaway, the Nusas and the Sasso-ish matter, to say, no, we can never just stay put and expect that these students who are liberals at Wits and UCT and other universities to speak for us. We have to come and play a part. It is, again, their own matter and problem if they want to help. But it must be us. It must be ourselves. And they took it further to universities and to high schools and further down. Now this is the conscientization, the mental liberation that must be given to our people. At the present moment, we have redressed as a country, ideologically speaking. We have gone back to that situation where we say the leaders know what is good for us. And we have been sold a democracy that comes every 2 years, because now it's 2021 and it's going to be 2024. And then we are bogged up with wanting to have votes and so on, without actually going to say, what are they for? Fine, parties have gone to parliament, parties have won, but what does it mean for people? People must ask themselves. You can't vote for a party and the following day to against that same party. You must be able to say to the party, now that I've given you the vote, what is coming for us? And for those leaders who are just leaders for themselves, we had a term for them. We said they were non-whites, because we had to assert the blackness of our own people to themselves, so that we don't become a negative of who we are. And we can see some of these terms are coming back. When you listen to the media and other people who are commentators, they talk about us as non-whites. We're not non-whites. We're not a negative of anything. We are black people. We are loved by God, and ourselves should love ourselves, but we must become active citizenry, so that these things that we want, we must champion them ourselves. So the issue of conscientization is very important. But what makes me happy is that young people at universities, particularly those who go to liberal universities and the universities that are seen to be very white and prestigious, it is those students who feel the rejection by those institutions, and they are coming back to say, no, we are not accepted here.
Yeah.
But the vehicle they need, it's the vehicle that they had of the black consciousness movement in the past, the Pan-Africanist movement in the past, that says, let us come together, let's sit down, let's educate. Because you see, people are not just like robots or on autopilot, they can wake up. There must be an intervening ideology that says, where will we be in the next 5-10 years? We can't just sit like that and hope that economically things are going to change and they're going to be brought by one man. No, there's no such a thing as one person who's a president who can say, no, things have changed and they're going to change. It doesn't work like that.
All right. I think we're going to take a short break, because I understand we've got 2 minutes to get to the next break, and I wanted to bring you in there, Mr. Mlota. I promise as soon as we get back from this break, we'll engage you further on this. Let's take a short break here on Unfiltered. We'll continue this discussion at least for the next 15 minutes here on Channel 404. Please stay with us. As we wrap up this discussion, at least for the next 15 minutes, reflecting on black consciousness and its relevance today. And Mr. Mlota, let me bring you in there. I promised to do so before we went to the break. I mean, you know, we're starting to see, in particular amongst young people, what Mr. Tukwani was referring to, you know, fees must fall, for example, where there's calls for a decolonized education. Talk to us a bit about that, and how the Pan-African movement itself, you know, together with these young people, you know, would be able to drive these particular challenges that these students are facing.
Yes, look, Pan-Africanism, both as a philosophy and ideology, did not just stand alone. It always had a program. Initially, at its first phase, was to fight and eliminate colonialism in the continent and to unite the continent. It was uniting the people of the continent against the evils of the time. And it was quite a way. And this program is well outlined by the founding fathers. Kwame Nkrumah outlined the goals and the objective of Pan-Africanism, including the dangers of neocolonialism, where Africa is largely trapped today. Now, after liberation, the goals and the objective of and the program of Pan-Africanism is to embark on the economic and social development, and obviously political development that will unite and remove the borders of the country. Now, the colonization is that of education, decolonization of the education, means that the education continue to prepare the young people, particularly the learners, for the future that does not exist, for the future that does not suit the continent. It orientate them to come and serve others. It does not orientate them to come and develop the economy for their post in betterment, and it does not focus them into the future. And those are the the reason why. Now the leaders are even overtaken by the student, realizing that no, this kind of education is taking us nowhere. It basically makes us to still feel, to believe in things that are not there.
Prof, you're within that particular space. Young people are not being prepared, for the realization of what of development of Africa. How are they going to participate in that in future and deal with the challenges that the continent itself is facing? Are they not being prepared for that?
So, I mean, part of that whole movement, 2015, 2016, I think it was at its height at the universities, was because we were not centering Africa in our curriculum. We were marginalizing the contributors to African knowledge. We were marginalizing African cultures. You cannot develop on the basis of other people's cultures. You can only do that on the basis of your own. And so many of the people who contributed to knowledge on this continent and in the diaspora, because we must always remember that component also within Pan-Africanism, they were not being read by our students, and that was part of why students were rebelling as well. I just happened to be at the Museum of Black Civilization in Dakar on Thursday, and it was very interesting because this museum took years to put together, and it actually depicts not only the history of humankind that you can find here in South Africa, but also the contribution of Pan-Africanism to black civilization. And I think we need more of those kinds of...
We've seen movements like hashtag Black Lives Matter also come up.
So we need it... to keep reminding ourselves, I think we as academics, we failed our students by not incorporating that in the curriculum. And I think that the way in which we approached it now largely was also problematic, because we then did it from a very technocratic standpoint. Oh, let's just add Biko or fun onto the curriculum and then all is well, which does not challenge the very foundations and structuring of our knowledge systems out there.
Thank you for saying that. I never thought that, we would have someone in the academic space acknowledge, some of those faults. Mr. Gordy, what needs to happen then? Before we run out of time, I understand we've got 10 minutes, or 6-7 minutes or so left. What then needs to happen for Africa to realize its potential? We've got leaders, some on the continent, who clearly are not getting the idea of black consciousness, Pan-Africanism, the development of the African continent. You've got young people stepping up, trying to say, look, something is wrong. But what needs to happen? I think I'll give each of you a chance on that. What then needs to happen on the African continent to save the face of what the likes of Kwame Nkrumah and Steve Biko had fought for?
I think at an instinctive level, the African people always yearn for unity. But the challenge we're having is that of a captured leadership, captured by external interests and themselves serving as local rogue elements for their own interests. We need to enhance the capacity of the people to drive change. Of course, that cannot happen spontaneously, because spontaneous struggles or leaderless struggles, we've seen what happened in Egypt. We need organization, we need mobilization. I think that was the call of Kwame Nkrumah, mobilization, organization, to conscientize, to raise the awareness of our people. And I think Thomas Sankara gave us a good example of how society can be instrumental in driving development, which in 4 years, they were able to achieve much more than what had been achieved in decades. So, meaning the centrality of the people, not amandla ngawethu as a meaningless slogan, but as a true expression that power resides with the people. And leaders must not be scared of the people, but must actually submit themselves to the people. So the most important thing is ensuring that our people have an understanding and an appreciation that they are their own liberators and they are the ones who make history and not leaders.
Mr. Tukwana, then how do we ensure then that the relevance of black consciousness, the relevance, it's still relevant today? How do we address some of those issues by incorporating the challenges that many would argue we're facing currently?
We must first kill the narrative that says organizations that stand for black consciousness, for Pan-Africanism, are no longer relevant today. And that we must move on and not talk about the past. Remember, we must teach our young, and when I say young, I'm not saying start at 18 years. I'm saying starting way back when they are very, very young, inside the home, to teach them about where we come from as a country. And that Steve Biko, Robert Sobukwe, and those kind of people died. I always make this example when someone says it is something for which I'm prepared to die. And Steve Biko died. And he had an opportunity not to die. And Diro died. And they actually put their lives so that these beliefs, this consciousness, this ideology can thrive. Because he then says, it is better for one to die for an idea that will live than to live for an idea that will die. So we must go back to these young people in high schools, in lower primary schools and universities, and hold discussions, discuss about who they are. While we are insisting and pressurizing the education system to incorporate the freedom of the mind. That we must do. We must pressurize. But we'll get more prize when it is the young people themselves to teach them. You know, there's a professor who says, teach, brother. And we must do that all the time. We must. We have left teaching, and I'm talking about teaching of what is relevant and what works for us.
Teaching of what is relevant, Mr. Moloto?
Yes, and look, all nations, and inclusive of Africa, has people, it must serve its people, and Africa is vast in terms of worth, and all what we need to do, the leaders need to do, and we need to do, is to identify our core interests as a nation and people and serve those. Our policies must be derived from the experiences and the day-to-day lives of our people. Now that is important. Now the development of our people must be the one driven by our own experiences. Now we cannot therefore divorce the fact that Africa is rich and its people are poor. There is something wrong there. Because the leaders continue to lead only by becoming the agents of the foreign countries.
Yeah. All right. Mr. Moloto, and Prof, just your last words there. Obviously, we can't just give lip service to this. There actually needs to be some action.
There needs to be action among all of us. We need to be able to strengthen institutions like the African Union, but also to strengthen our own organizations and our own movements, as everybody here was saying. I think that for as long as racism persists, imperialism persists, we are going to have the relevance of both black consciousness and Pan-Africanism. But one last point, because our president is being inaugurated on the 25th, which is Africa Day, and I'm hoping that this is a symbolic of the fact that he's actually going to take up the Pan-African agenda, that he's going to, that he's going to push this
and
forward.
I really think many were arguing there's a symbolism on having it actually on Africa Day. So I think certainly many commentators have been speaking about that. Mr. Kodi, I'm afraid we do not have much time. I really want to take a look at some of the tweets. Some of the viewers who are watching, let's have those up. Tembi says, it's time Africa media learn to talk about our great son and daughter's Pan-Africanism, and please stop behaving that this is the USA, CNN, European media, and let them talk about South African issues. Let's take another tweet very quickly before we take our poll question as well. Black consciousness ideology today is being eroded by greed amongst politicians who are hell-bent on lining their pockets through dubious tender systems and other means. Thanks, Collins, for engaging with us. I don't seem to see the name there, but thanks for engaging with us. We need it now more than ever. We seriously need to unite. That's from Odibe, and preach black consciousness. A biggest problem which was done was thinking black consciousness was limited to politics instead of what it's meant to be. The rest of that tweet, of course, you'll be able to find on SABC News Online. Modiba, thank you very much for engaging with us. Buckwald says, as we slowly lose our culture as black people, language deterioration, black identity reachings still relevant, or teachings, I guess that should be. Thanks so much for engaging with us. Let's take a look, one more tweet there. To me, black consciousness is more than an ideology, but a way of life in terms of realization of our values, standards and outlook to life. Therefore, its relevance is infinite. Thanks so much, Max, for sending us that tweet as well. And thanks, of course, to you all who've been engaging with us. Of course, we asked you, as we did earlier on in the program, is the black consciousness ideology still relevant today? 62% of you say yes, it is. 22% say no, and 16% say I don't care. Using, of course, the hashtag Africa Month. I see you clapping, Mr. Gordy. That poll seems to really make you happy. But anyway, thank you so much for engaging with us. Thank you so much for coming through. We really do appreciate it. And of course, that's all for tonight. And thank you very much for watching. We'll see you again next week as we continue to have our discussions. And I think everyone's looking forward to the next week to see who will make it into, of course, that cabinet of the President, Cyril Ramaphosa. I'm sure we'll give you all those details during the course of the week, but we'll see you next week, Sunday. Thanks so much for watching us here on Unfiltered. I'm Crisalda Lewis. Have a good night.
Africa will unite, will celebrate, and she will dance again.